Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. We're going to be studying the 6th Psalm in this lesson, and we'll begin by reading Psalm 6 in its entirety. Psalm 6, for the director of music, according to strings, a psalm of David. Yahweh, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, Yahweh, for I am faint. Heal me, Yahweh, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Yahweh, how long? Turn, Yahweh, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. Away from me, all you who do evil. For Yahweh has heard my weeping. Yahweh has heard my cry for mercy. Yahweh accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame. We're going to examine this psalm and entitle our lesson, A Prayer for Healing. A Prayer for Healing. Psalm 3 is a prayer for deliverance offered by David during the time of Absalom's rebellion. David was forced to flee Jerusalem, and many believed God had abandoned the king in favor of his rebellious son. David knew this was untrue and continued to proclaim his confidence that God was a shield around him and the one who lifts his head high. David could go to sleep at night knowing that it was Yahweh who sustained him. Then, Psalms 4 and 5. Psalms 4 and 5 were likewise written during tumultuous times in David's life, maybe even during the same season of betrayal and civil unrest. Through his troubles, with all its groaning and sorrow, David still believed this truth. Psalm 5, verse 12. Surely, Yahweh, you bless the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield. What do the people of God do, however, when they have yet to feel that God has heard their cries? Psalm 6 says, well, you keep on calling. Keep on calling. Now, Psalm 6, just like Psalms 3, 4, and 5, fall into the general category of lament. And these lament prayers include 5 essential elements. There is, of course, an address to God, followed usually by a complaint or some kind of request, a petition, and then a statement of confidence in God's ability to help in this situation, and finally a resolution to praise. Psalms 3 through 5 followed this formula. They were addressed to God as prayers. They included complaints about David's enemies and the need he had for deliverance, asking for God to protect and avenge and deliver and rescue. They affirmed David's confidence that God would protect him because of his position as God's anointed king, and each of them closed with some kind of burst of praise. From Yahweh comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. Psalm 3, verse 8. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Yahweh, make me dwell in safety. Psalm 4 and verse 8. And finally, surely, Yahweh, you bless the righteous, you surround them with your favor as with a shield. Psalm 5 and verse 12. Psalm 6 follows in this general pattern. It's another prayer from David, and it includes all those same essential elements of a lament. It opens with an address to Yahweh in verse 1. It includes complaints about David's physical health, about his emotional distress, and ties both of these to the work of his enemies. It asks God for mercy, healing, and deliverance. It states the confidence that David has that God has indeed heard his prayer. And finally, David praises God for shaming his enemies. And so we see Psalm 6, like Psalms 3 through 5, is another lament prayer of David. And spoiler alert, we're going to see a lot more of these as we continue in our study of the Psalter. Now, let's talk for a moment about the structure of Psalm 6. It's pretty simple. It's built on a very typical kind of 3-stanza format. We have stanza 1, which is verses 1 through 3, and that's the initial appeal appeal to Yahweh, which is supported by reasons for this appeal in terms of David's own suffering. Then the middle section, verses 4 through 7, is sort of a repeat of the first stanza with more appeal and more development of the reasons for the appeal. But then in verses 8 through 10, we have in the third stanza kind of a sudden and radical change in tone, which we will discuss when we get to that section. One more note about the structure, and that is the superscript, or the header of Psalm 6. We have another kind of uncertain word in this superscript for the director of music with stringed instruments according to Sheminith, a psalm of David. Scholars seem to agree that Sheminith is some kind of musical notation. In fact, the New American Standard 2020 edition translates it upon an 8-string lyre. And so we have the superscript and a basic understanding of the structure and genre, and now let's dive into the content of Psalm 6. It begins with the first stanza. Yahweh, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, Yahweh, for I am faint. Heal me, Yahweh, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Yahweh? How long? It seems clear from this first stanza that David is in serious physical distress. Notice he is faint or languishing. His bones are in agony or troubled. In the second stanza, he's going to mention his proximity to the grave. He believes that he is about to die. Now, while the end of the prayer mentions the king's enemies, here it's noteworthy that David is not initially ascribing his fatal condition to them. Rather, he is operating under the assumption that God is angry with him and that indeed Yahweh is the cause of his suffering. However, much like the book of Job, it doesn't seem that David can identify a reason why God would be angry with him. David neither confesses any sin, nor does he really ask for forgiveness. Instead, he merely begs God to stop angrily rebuking him and wrathfully disciplining him. Now, David's petition is simple. In verse 2, he says, have mercy on me, heal me. Mercy, or graciousness, in this context means pity or compassion. Now, what's noteworthy is that most prayers in the Psalter, which beckon God to show mercy, are in fact petitions for forgiveness. You might especially think of Psalm 51, which according to the superscript is a psalm, a prayer of confession written after Nathan the prophet rebuked David for his sin with Bathsheba and against Uriah. And it begins famously with those words, have mercy on me, O God. Here, however, David's focus is not on any kind of sin or trespass. His focus is physical healing. And this is actually not very common among the Psalms. It's led some scholars to the conclusion that maybe David is using his physical malady as a literary or theological tool to speak of his weakened spiritual condition. Now, either way, whether it's a literal physical illness or it's some kind of metaphor, the misery that David felt was very real. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Yahweh? How long? Many laments include the question, how long? Let me give you a few examples. Psalm 74, 10 and 11 says, how long will the enemy mock you, God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them. Or Psalm 80 and verse 4, how long, Yahweh Almighty, will your anger smolder against the prayers of your people? Or look at this from Psalm 13. How long, Yahweh, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? The seriousness and urgency of David's prayer is reflected in this pleading question, how long, Yahweh, how long? In the next stanza, he expands even further on his condition. Let's read verses 4 through 7. Turn, Yahweh, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. On what ground does David ask God for forgiveness? Well, on the basis of God's unfailing love. Carson explains the significance of this Hebrew word. The term chesed is one of the richest in the Bible, often denoting God's steadfast, loyal love for his covenant people Israel. It had special meaning for God's people coming out of Egypt, and God promised this love to many generations of Israelites, including David. More than half of the Bible's references to this covenantal love are found in Psalms, about half of those in Psalms of David. The richness of the Hebrew word chesed is reflected in how difficult it is to render it in English. Some translations say mercy, others loving kindness, others steadfast love. Essentially, David is appealing to the love of God that he has for his covenant people, and especially the love he has for David as his covenant king. In addition to God's unfailing love, David adds a second reason why God should heal him, and that is that dead people can't worship God. If I'm dead, who's going to praise you? And finally, the third reason David is desperate for God's healing and deliverance is his own miserable helplessness. I'm worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. You can hear not only the intensity, but maybe I'd also say the exaggerated language that David employs to express the seriousness of his condition. Kinder says this: depression and exhaustion as complete as this are beyond self-help or good advice. Even prayer has died away. The foes who would normally have roused David only crush his spirit now. If anything is to save him, it will owe nothing to his own efforts. Such is the extremity which God is about to transform. When Moses was 120 years old, Deuteronomy says his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. David, however, feels as though the light of his eyes is about to fade to black. Only God can save him. Now, shockingly, the last stanza of this three-stanza prayer drastically and dramatically changes in mood, in tone, and in its rhetorical audience. No longer is God the one being addressed. Now we see David turning his attention elsewhere, verses 8 through 10. Away from me, all you who do evil, for Yahweh has heard my weeping. Yahweh has heard my cry for mercy. Yahweh accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame. Away from me, all you who do evil, may be the same words that Jesus was drawing on when he said, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness, in Matthew 7, verse 23. David is not merely trying to shoo away his foes. He is pronouncing sovereign judgment as God's anointed king. Again, we might ask, well, on what grounds can David confidently say these words? Where did this newfound confidence come from? Well, it's because he affirms that Yahweh has noticed his despair, listened to his pleading, and has accepted his petition. But notice also that it does not appear that God has done anything yet. And this is a point I want to really emphasize about the nature of lament prayers. David somehow realizes that God has heard him and that God has accepted his prayer. And that apparently was enough for David to have this incredible mental recovery. This is how Goldingay explains it. In the Psalms, there can be two stages to answers to prayer. Stage one is when God listens to the prayer and makes a commitment to deal with the matter the prayer raised. Stage two is when God then acts. In between stages 1 and 2, you live in suspense and by faith. So it's evidently by faith that David perks up and condemns evildoers. In fact, the king is so confident that God will act on his prayer that he boldly proclaims at the end that all his enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish, and they will turn back. Now, this is fascinating to me. You know, since the Enlightenment and the modern scientific revolution, I think believers struggle more to see the work of God in the world. When sick people recover, medical treatment is often accredited as the cause. When depression and anxiety abates, the praise goes to therapy and pharmaceuticals. To encourage people of faith not to give up on prayer, some have pointed to the emotional and psychological benefits prayer offers, essentially saying even if no one is listening, prayer is still a healthy exercise. But that's not at all how King David or the Lord Jesus would have ever thought about prayer. David believed in God's power to save, to rescue, and even to heal. In fact, Jesus believed that persistent prayer changes the mind of God and spurns him to action. Jesus told this well-known parable in Luke chapter 18. It says Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, "Grant me justice against my adversary." For some time he refused. But finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. The Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly." Paul believed that God is over all, through all, and in all, according to Ephesians 4 and verse 6. So while there's absolutely nothing wrong with doctors, counselors, and medication, and Christians who need specialized help should absolutely seek it, benefiting from such scientific advancements should never create dependency on the power of human industry. Let me say that again. Benefiting from such advancement should not create dependency on the power of human industry. In fact, that's what God was worried about when he gave the Israelites the good land he had prepared for them. He was concerned that they would eat, be satisfied, and forget about their dependency on God. Dependency, by the way, they should have learned about during those 40 years they spent in the wilderness. But remember Yahweh your God, Moses said, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 18. And I think that same reminder needs to echo loudly in our modern age, especially as we think about the message of Psalm 6. David came to God for healing at a desperate time in his life, even when he thought death was certain. But we notice in Psalm 6 that as David felt the presence of death, He felt that his enemies were overtaking him and overpowering him. He still had confidence in God. Confidence not only that God heard his prayer, but that also he would answer that prayer. Now, we don't know how God responded. We don't know what the outcome of that petition was in practical terms in David's life, but knowing that God heard him, knowing that David could entrust this difficulty in his life to Yahweh, gave him a renewed confidence, a renewed vigor, a renewed zeal to go on living for the Lord. And so we wait sometimes in faith, knowing that God has heard us, but still waiting for God to act. And like Jesus says, we keep on praying and we don't lose heart. That's Psalm 6. I hope you'll come back and be with us as we continue our study through the Psalter. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.